Good morning, and welcome. We thank you so much for joining us on this MLK Day, this day of service, and we thank you to all of you for not finding it robbery to join us on this day to celebrate the life and legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. With the Fort Lauderdale MLK Celebration Committee. So this young man, I'm pleasured and pleased to introduce you to him. And I got to give you not all of it, but most of what he does, because I know it's long, but I got to do him justice.
Please, not long, not long.
I have to do him justice. Calvin earned his bachelor's of science in journalism from the University of Missouri. He's worked as an anchor reporter in 3 of the nation's top 10 markets, media markets, that is, including Philadelphia, Atlanta, and Dallas. When he joined Local 10 News, Hughes and his family did not hesitate to delve into the richly diverse community of South Florida. In 2008, after reporting on a story about Haitian refugees who risked and, in some cases, lost their lives in a deadly voyage set for the shores of Miami, Mr. Hughes relentlessly pursued an opportunity to report comprehensively on Haiti. In Miami, the Miami New Times indeed voted Calvin Hughes Miami's best TV news anchor. His reporting touches the souls of our community and abroad, from being one of 2 South Floridian journalists permitted to report live from Pope Benedict XVI's historic trip to Cuba, to Miami's Heat's NBA finals and championships, to presidential debates, to Coretta Scott King, Maya Angelou, and so many others. He's covered and interviewed a range of stories and people. He's a proud member of Kappa Alpha Psi Fraternity, Inc., an advisory board member of Suited for Success, a nonprofit that provides professional attire to economically disadvantaged men, and donates his time and talents as a keynote speaker and MC almost weekly at schools, churches, civic engagements, charitable fundraisers throughout Broward, Miami-Dade counties. And we are certainly appreciative and happy to have him here with us on this morning. Ladies and gentlemen, from wherever you're tuned in from, please help me introduce Emmy award-winning journalist, Channel 10 WPLG anchor extraordinaire, Mr. Calvin Hughes, AKA I call him my TV family as well. Calvin Hughes, give him a heart if you can. Right. Give him a heart.
Stitch, is very, very nice of you to have that introduction. Oh my gosh. I should have you on at 4, 5, 6, and 11 o'clock when I come on, when we introduce our newscast. That would be really nice. But that's it's very nice of you to say that. What I'd like to do is, if you don't know who is going to be a part of the program today, which we are talking about criminal justice, it's Broward County Public Defender's Office, Gordon Weeks, newly elected. Broward County State Attorney Harold Pryor, newly elected. Broward County Sheriff Gregory, he's been in the office, but newly elected. NAACP President, I believe, Marsha Ellison. And Broward County Bar Association, Robert Vaughan. The 17th Judicial Circuit Court of Florida, Judge Jack Tuter. And the Broward County Human Services, Justice Services Department person who's going to be speaking with us is Tamica Gaynor. I believe everyone is here. I don't have the full thing up on my computer, but Gordon, we're going to begin with you. We're going to have opening statements from each of the panelists. And Gordon, I'll begin with you.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the opportunity to have this discussion on this wonderful Martin Luther King Day of celebration. It's so important that we recognize the issues that we need to confront in this community, not only in this state, but in this nation, when it comes to criminal justice and reform. As so eloquently pointed out previously, there are some serious issues of equity in our criminal justice system that we will confront. I am confident with the leadership of the individuals that have been elected into office. We will try to reshape and confront the issues of reform that are very much sought after by this community. So with that, I won't take up much time, but thank you very kindly for this opportunity.
Okay, Mr. Pryor, you're up next.
Thank you, Mr. Hughes, and thank you, Mr. Weeks, and members of the committee. I want to begin with a quote that I used, I think, a week ago, and I actually used in my inaugural address. And it's only fitting because Dr. Martin Luther King is a national hero and a member or someone that I've always looked up to as an inspiration to my career in life. And he quotes, the quote is, "We are tied together in a single garment of destiny, caught in an inescapable network of mutuality. And whatever affect one directly, it affects us all indirectly." And so I say that to say that there's various stakeholders here on this meeting. And I will say that we're going to have to work with the chief judge and the judiciary. We're going to have to work with the public defender's office. We're going to have to work with the sheriff and the various law enforcement entities in Broward County. And so we're all tied together in initiating this reform, but also ensuring that we have safer communities. And I totally understand that we have a system that has been traditionally stacked against people of color and poor folk. And I'm going to do everything in my power to ensure that we have a criminal justice system that is just and equitable for all people. So thank you. And I look forward to the informed discussion that we're having today.
Okay, Mr. Pryor, thank you so much. Gregory Tony, you're up.
Hey, good morning, everyone. I'll be very short. I know there's not a lot of time for us to really expand into the introductions, but over the last 2 years, I've been very fortunate to have a head start in terms of reforming what I can reform in terms of the criminal justice system, specifically here at BSO. And so I'm excited to see that we have a new public defender, a new state attorney, two vital key gatekeepers when it comes to the criminal justice system that is going to allow me to continue the efforts I've been doing here, but also to have a greater impact on the criminal justice system as a whole. So I look forward.
Okay, and thank you, Mr. Tony. And Marsha Ellison, NAACP.
Thank you and good morning. I bring you greetings on behalf of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People on this wonderful MLK Day. We know that African Americans more often are and more likely to be involved with law enforcement, more likely to be and more often are arrested. They are charged more harshly and sentenced more harshly than their white counterparts. So we may have to make sure that the community works together to improve, we can have safe communities and also make sure we address criminal justice reform. And so we have worked the NAACP for years to make sure that it happens. We are so excited with our new leadership. If what you have in office does not work, then grow your own is what we say in the NAACP. And we believe that we have done that. And we look forward to making sure that the inequities that are happening in the criminal justice systems in the 17th Circuit are addressed. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Marsha. And Robert Vaughan, Broward County Bar Association.
Good morning, Calvin. And thank you to the Martin Luther King Celebration Committee for having us all together to celebrate the life and legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. We should take a moment as we're having these discussions to revisit the concept of our social compact and the implications of decades and centuries of our society's existence in breach of that social contract. Our social contract is simply a promise as citizens and as a society where each member of our society promises to follow certain rules and laws. In exchange, we are afforded the privileges and protections of living together within this collective. America's promise is based upon a society of laws where no one is above the law, where every citizen is entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, with an equal opportunity to fulfill his or her God-given potential. That promise, for many, has existed only in the breach. For many Americans, the burdens and the obligations of that compact manifested by over-policing, mass incarceration, and social rules that seem designed to perpetuate a permanent underclass. Those are in constant imbalance with the promised benefits and privileges that seem to only fall to others. A full half century ago, Martin Luther King Jr. observed that the struggle for true equality would be much more difficult post-Jim Crow. He observed that it is much easier to integrate a lunch counter than it is to guarantee a livable income, much easier to integrate a public park than it is to make genuine, quality, integrated education a reality for all. 50 years later, we're still fighting for true equality for all of our citizens. Can there be any question that we are in breach of that social compact? Can there be any question about why so many of our fellow citizens or neighbors or friends are increasingly disillusioned and disaffected? The need for change is urgent. It is overdue. There is indeed a fierce urgency of now. Our democracy depends on it. Thanks for having this conversation.
All right, Mr. Vaughan, thank you so much. And the Honorable Jack Tuter.
Thank you, Calvin, for inviting me, Commissioner Holness and the committee to discuss these important topics. I, like Sheriff Tony, want to use our time for our discussions. So I would just say in a general way that with the new sheriff, the new public defender, and the new state attorney, we are committed to making progress on the criminal justice reforms that are needed in the county. It's going to take time, but I'm confident working together, we're going to get some of these problems solved. We've solved some of them already, but there's much work to do ahead. So I look forward to these discussions, and I look forward to talking to everybody who's interested in this topic and seeing what significant changes we can make over the next few years.
Okay, the Honorable Jack Tuter, thank you very much. And Tamica Gaynor.
Hi, yes, good morning. Thank you all for having me here. I also like to start with a quote. Alvin Toffler said that the illiterate of the 21st century won't be those who cannot read or write. It will be those individuals who fail to learn, unlearn, and to read. So I think there's a shared agreement that there are disparities in the criminal justice system. And I believe that at the heart of reform efforts, there has to be education, accountability, and I look forward to those.
Tamika, thank you. It's a little difficult to understand you. I'm not sure what might be the issue. I don't know if it's a microphone issue or what, but it's a little difficult to understand you, but we're definitely going to come back to you as well. Joy, I believe you have some statistics that we can possibly share on the screen here, and it talks about criminal justice. And one of the statistics, if we are not able to share that so everybody can see it, it is a half century after the Civil Rights Movement, trial judges throughout Florida sentenced Blacks to harsher punishment than whites. A Herald Tribune investigation found that when Blacks are sentenced by white judges, their sentences are on average 20% higher than when Blacks are sentenced by Black judges. So on that last point, I can begin with you, Gregory, Tony. What are your thoughts about those statistics? And do you think that there is something you can do to possibly change that, or are they spot on?
No, thanks, Colin. Of course, the answer, they're spot on, but they're not unique and they're not new. I think that some of these statistics that you've heard in terms of the disparities in regards to how African Americans are just inundating the system has been going on for decades and decades and decades. And there's been very little that we have done as far as gatekeepers in the system to really pull back on some of these numbers. In terms of what we can do, and what I've recognized in this organization when I came in 2 years ago was the importance of making sure, and this is essential to me, that the leadership components that represent each and every single department, whether it be from the state attorney's office to the public defender's office, must have a true understanding about what these numbers mean. They must be able to recognize that there are systemic and institutional racism that exists within their organizations. And then they have to put people in place that are reflective of the community they represent and have the willpower to start introducing policies, protocols, and procedures that can put a dent in some of these things. For the law enforcement role, we have the largest body out here, really spreading across 1,300 square miles, Calvin. And our men and women touch more of this community on a daily basis. And I've had personnel who didn't even know what Jim Crow was. And so that's an educational gap. So my opinion is we have to educate our personnel, put policies in place, and then make sure that we are really receptive to the fact that Black people, brown people in this community are not viewed as their same peers. And I'll just caveat really quickly, and that we just seen this again take place with what occurred in the Capitol, in the duality between our criminal justice systems and how Black people are treated versus how our white counterparts are treated. We had Black Lives Matter movement that went out and protest up in the DC area, and the National Guard was deployed across a multitude of spectrums in the Capitol and shut things down. But
Absolutely.
yet the image and the viewpoints of how our white counterparts and brothers and sisters are viewed are not as threatening. So there's a lot of things that needs to be expressed clearly, accepted, and then we have to start modifying from the top down.
Absolutely. And I do want to touch on that point. And the other issue is that law enforcement also found that there is an enemy within. Even some of their own personnel were out. Some who were off duty that day were actually at the Capitol riots. But we could talk about that in just a moment, because I think you touched on a very good point about re-educating some of your police officers and your detectives. What's interesting is that I remember on election night in Broward County, the headline read, "New Black Broward County Public Defender, new Black State Attorney, new Black Sheriff." So with all of that happening, the expectations, you might say, are really high in Broward County that there's going to be some immediate change. And Gordon, I'll begin with you on that point. I'm sure you've probably heard the expectations that somehow when you come into office that you're going to sprinkle some magic dust and the whole system is going to be changed. Talk about the pressures of having to deal with that.
I'm glad you raised that very important point. We entered into this system and recognized that there are years and years of inequities that have to be unraveled, addressed for us to begin to move forward. There's an incredible demand for reform. There is a sense of urgency that it needs to be done yesterday rather than tomorrow. And I recognize that, but this system did not get this way overnight. There are years and years of structural, institutional racism and inequalities that have been put in place that have allowed it to get to where it's at today. We have to go back and dismantle that and recognize that, communities of colors have been over-policed, over-punished for years. This is not something that is new, but we have to make sure that when we approach this new reform, that we approach it with a sense of equity, that we approach it with a sense of equality and accountability, but is based on the data. I've heard a lot of discussions about how to do this. Part of it is education and retraining and making sure that folks understand what implicit bias means and how it enters into their decision making. But I can tell you, you cannot train away fear. That is a reality that we have to confront. We have to figure out ways to address that and still be able to move forward. We have to make sure that those decision makers in those critical points, when they are making decisions that have disparate outcomes, we have to be bold and courageous enough to identify those decision makers and then compare them to those decision makers that are making the right decision and doing things in an equitable manner. And then figure out how we get folks to move forward in a more reasonable way. It is going to take a real strong and courageous and bold agenda to have folks that have been doing things for many, many years. Yeah. This includes, the folks that bring people and identify the neighborhoods where law enforcement has to be dispatched to, that has then makes the decisions where they're going to make arrests, then brings them into the system and then decides what charges are going to be filed, and then decides what punishment is what's going to be levied. All of those decision makers at all of those points where inequity has existed for many, many years have to be retooled. We have to confront it. Yeah. We have to identify those decision makers that are making those bad decisions and figure out ways how we get better decision makers in those points.
I agree. And Marsha made a good point. She says what her mantra is, what you have in office. If it doesn't work, then grow your own. So Marsha, I believe that that sort of happened in Broward County, but what are your expectations? And I'm sure you have given your thoughts to the newly elected officials who hold those high positions about what your recommendations are, correct?
Many times,
Yeah.
both prior to the election and since. But I want to make sure that, you know, we examine all of the entry points, for example, for folk, particularly people of color in the juvenile justice or the criminal justice system, and particularly with the juveniles. The juvenile arrest in Broward County is extremely high, even with school out, and school has to be is an entry point that we found that was one of the highest or the highest in the state of Florida just a few short years ago. Unfortunately, we were building, doing great things are happening. However, once the Douglas tragedy happened, then everything changed. And I just received some data, I believe, from DJJ that talked about the number of 11-year-olds that were being arrested and charged with felonies in most cases here in Broward County. Well, obviously, that's very troubling. So now we have to go back to all the entry points, including who is the agency that is arresting these children. What school, what teacher, I mean, who is it that, you know, is causing these children to find that they have one answer we find too often. Law enforcement, in many cases, when it comes to Black and brown people, have one answer when there is an issue, and that's incarceration, it's handcuffs. And so when we talk about the leaders that are in that space now, we certainly hold them accountable. I like them all. I consider them my friend, but we need to make sure that change does happen. And we certainly recognize that we didn't get into this mess overnight, and many of almost all of them we've worked with and for years in order to get this thing done. But we are looking for, we've got data, so much data. We understand the issues, but we're looking for each one of these leaders to stand up and be about the change that we seek. I mean, they are in very powerful positions.
Yes.
They understand the issues that affect them. So now we are looking for action today. We're not looking for excuses. We're looking today.
So you have your mandate, Mr. Pryor. So there you go. You have to do something not yesterday. I mean, well, not tomorrow, not down the line, but yesterday is what Marsha is saying. So let's drill down on it. Now that you've had some time in office, what exactly are you looking to change now that you're in there?
Yeah, well, thank you. Exactly 2 weeks in office. I'm proud to report to everyone that I have all the answers right now. But I will say, you know, President Ellison, she has my number and she has communicated that she will be calling me. And I welcome that. And I welcome the community contacting me and holding me accountable. The great thing about this position as the state attorney, I am the chief prosecuting officer of this circuit. I set the agenda. And my goal is to set smart and reasonable criminal justice reform so we can govern ourselves accordingly within this circuit. As my dad would always say, and I think Jay-Z probably took it from him, which we're going to have to talk about that on a copyright infringement aspect. Men lie, women lie, but numbers don't, right? And so it's important for us in the criminal justice realm to pay attention to the numbers, to pay attention to the data, and govern our reforms accordingly. It's extremely alarming when our children only make up about 39 to 40% of our population, but yet they make up nearly 65 to 75%. Before it was 75% of the youth arrest, it's down to 65%. Yeah, someone could point to that and say we're down 10%. That's still extremely high, right? And so how do we fix that? We need to fix that by working with law enforcement officers, working with the sheriff's department, working with the various law enforcement agencies in Broward County and training and assisting them and helping them to fix this issue. And what is the issue? It's been the issue since the existence of time of Black men and women being in this country. Our communities are just fundamentally over-policed. And so we need to fix that by implementing robust implicit bias training programs, not only in the law enforcement agencies, as pointed out by Sheriff Tony, but also in public defenders' offices, also in state attorneys' offices, and also in the judiciary. And I would ask Chief Judge Tuter to please consider doing that extensively with our judiciary and doing those implicit bias training programs. But how do we do that? We have to prioritize things. I think we need to end this vicious cycle. And how do we do that? We need to encourage our law enforcement officers and agencies to issue more civil citations. And I'm proud to report to everyone here that's attending this that I've instructed my data analysts and our members of our prosecutorial team to look at a way that we can screen cases that come in that weren't issued civil citations initially, and us potentially bouncing those back into the civil citation program like Miami-Dade does. So we're looking into that. And so there's various issues that we can focus on. We can expand our problem solving in therapeutic courts. We can expand the offenses that go into our diversion programs to keep people out of the system. And we need to reimagine what public safety is. Public safety isn't putting people with mental health issues and drug addiction issues in prison. That's actually getting them the help that they need. It's time for us to focus on those serious crimes, those crimes that affect our neighborhoods, that affect our communities. And I'm excited at the prospect of us being able to change the system and working with all our stakeholders and the community. And I want everyone to hold me accountable.
And Sheriff Tony, we'll come back to you and talk about reimagining police, which is another way of saying defund police and reusing some of the resources or reallocating some of the resources. But the Honorable Judge Tuter, you've been given a sort of a challenge here. Do you accept the challenge of retraining and also re-educating some of your judges so that they are not implicitly biased?
Well, first off, after one of the shootings that there was a lot of unrest in the country, I got with Gene Pettis, who was former president of the Florida Bar, and we already started down that path. We had 4 or 5 programs on implicit bias and criminal justice reform led by Gene Pettis. All of our judges attended. So we're on the path to doing that. We have more to do. And I pledge to do more in that area. About 35% of our judges have less than 5 years experience. So they come to the bench with, I guess, different perspectives because they haven't been there and ingrained in the system so long. So I'm committed on all of this. I'm particularly committed to get more African-American judges on the bench. It's been a struggle. We've done everything we can here locally with friends in Tallahassee, but we've had Republican governors the last 22 years who appointed most every judge that's on the bench right now. So I am committed, Calvin, on this. We're going to have weekly meetings with the sheriff and the public defender and state attorney, which we never had before. So we are committed to work in this area, make changes. We've made some significant changes already, and I pledge to keep up the bully pulpit that I have to keep these reforms going.
Thank you, Judge Tuter. Sheriff Tony, just your thoughts about the whole argument of defunding police and reallocating some of the resources and not being so harsh on some of the people who may deserve only a civil citation versus just going and getting in handcuffs and going behind bars, especially for some of our young people.
Right after the George Floyd murder up in Minneapolis, I had a chance to sit down with a multitude of different groups, including Black Lives Matter, and heard the argument about defunding police. And my discussion with them was that your point's noted, but it's not a matter of defunding the police. I don't think anyone wants the community to be less safer. They don't want to have the resources to respond to any major threat. What the community wants to see is, are we introducing community-based programs, training, whether it be racial equity, implicit bias training? Are we being more inclusive with the community to listen and then modify funding to the needs of the community? And we started much of that over the last 2 years. There was much discussion for years. In fact, the community was crying out for racial equity, implicit bias training, and ensuring that law enforcement would get this type of training. And I reallocated, I didn't defund, I reallocated $1 million of our budget to make sure that we were paying not only for our men, but for every law enforcement officer in this community to take this training. We created a social justice task force where we brought members in, and I caught a lot of heat. People say, oh, why would you have Black Lives Matter on there? They are a terrorist organization. They shouldn't be able to be included in the community. That's nonsense. They're part of the community, and the community that's suffering the most is the Black and brown community. Why would we ostracize the group that has the greatest voice and is receiving the greatest injustices out here? So we brought them in. Then we started looking at what can we do for mental health care. That was brought up, which is a huge issue. We proceeded out and brought in $500,000 in grant funds, and now we're reallocating that money to hire mental health care specialists to help us develop policies. So my point is, I think when you have a budget that's almost $1 billion, right? Thank you, Mr. Honus, and any other commissioners online. We have a responsibility to look at what the community is seeking and how we shift funding. And I can't ignore the fact that our jail, we spend roughly $278 million a year focused on keeping people in jail. Well, how much of that money are we reallocating to keep them out? So I think the message is clear what the community wants. In terms of civil citations, Calvin, we have not done, not even remotely close to being an exceptional job with this program. Marsha, Dell, and Gordon Weeks, and many others have fought hard to see this established, but yet the law enforcement body and the community collectively, not just BSO, but all the other municipals, have yet to really take advantage of this program and see these numbers change. And so this year, this is a big focal point on us as the sheriff's office, one of my agenda, to make sure we are getting these NTAs out, we're getting these civil citations out, because we're only exacerbating the system, and we're not going to fix it if we keep compounding on it.
So we've heard the mandate of re-educating, retraining. So for you, Gordon, in your mind, if you had a magic wand, how much time is it going to take to get from where we are to where we need to be? Is it generational? 5 years, 10 years? What are your thoughts?
You know, a lot of reform has already been put in place. A lot of the roots have been planted, and the seeds are now are being sowed. I think we will start seeing some fruits of our labor in short order, because I think, you know, based on some of the public pronouncements of all the stakeholders and the leaders of the various constitutional offices, it seems to be a very strong will and commitment to get this reform done. The question is going to be, how is that reform going to look? What are going to be the priorities? What are we going to tackle first? There's some low-hanging fruit, like, you know, bringing civil citation to the forefront, expanding diversion, looking at how we deal with our mentally ill and substance abuse folks, juveniles. Those are areas that we've already been doing a lot of work and can move forward. But one of the things we have to look at is where we're deploying our resources. Where are we putting the people in the community that do the work, that make those decisions about arrest? You know, my mother, you know, the wisdom of seniors, recognized that when they put a red light camera outside of her seniors community, that would increase the number of red light tickets by virtue of its location of senior citizens that lived in that community. And I stress that point because red light cameras are race neutral, gender neutral, and age neutral. They don't issue tickets based on the age or the gender or the race of the individual. But the wisdom of seniors knew that by placing it there, it would increase the number of seniors that lived there to get those tickets. And we have to recognize that as well. When we place our law enforcement resources in communities of color to go run through communities, kick down doors, and harass communities, then you will get a larger number of people arrested. We have to be a little bit more wise about where we place those resources. And that's going to be a challenge, not only for the sheriff, but all law enforcement leaders throughout this community, to recognize that there is a level of safety that people expect. There's a level of responsiveness from law enforcement that people expect, but we do not expect our communities to be over-policed so that you have a wider net cast in communities of colors that causes more people of color to enter into the criminal justice system.
Okay, and that is a phrase that has been used quite a bit here, the Black community being over-policed. And Robert Vaughan, I have looked over you for a couple of questions, and I am so sorry. Please forgive me. I have a list right here in front of me, and I was just going down it, and I went straight for Tamica. Please touch on any of those issues that we have addressed so far. You have the floor.
Whenever people hear me say, "I'll be brief," they start to celebrate. I will say this. The solution lies in the intersection between empathy, implicit bias recognition, and engagement. At a certain point, this conversation must include more than just the over-policed and the oppressed. It must include those who, even notwithstanding their own best efforts, are guilty of the over-policing and the oppression and the bias. And one of the most difficult things is for someone to admit to themselves, to have the level of introspection, to admit to themselves that they are flawed in that respect. And that can only, the solution there lies in engagement and empathy. We must engage in dialogue with each other. We must engage in the type of cultural improvement and engagement that allows us to see each other as something other than different, that allows us to see ourselves in someone who looks different than we do. That will improve the relationships between the policed and those doing the policing. It will improve the results between the judged and those doing the judging. It will improve the implementation of policy, which, while otherwise race neutral, in its implementation and execution, if the selection of the placement of those cameras is not done with an eye towards equality, then without question, the results will be biased. So we have to keep in mind the intersection between engagement, empathy, introspection, and implicit bias, and bring everybody into this discussion.
And I do want to say thank you very much, Robert, too. And once again, my apologies for not calling on you sooner. I want to say to all of the participants out there that I'm open for any questions. I do not claim to be the smartest guy in the room, so any questions that you have for me, please send them in the Q&A section so that I can ask on your behalf. I do want to say this because I'm hearing this over and over. If implicit bias training, if retraining and re-educating your staff members, if that was simply the answer to stopping what we're dealing with today, why hasn't it been done before? Why hasn't any other candidate come along? Okay, and Gordon, I will come to you, but I want to go to Mr. Pryor and Marsha for this. Why hasn't someone else come along and said, you know what, let me just retrain everybody? Go ahead.
Well, you know what, I'll as the younger member of our group, I'll defer to the older people. I don't know. I'm a millennial, and that's why I ran, because I think we can do it better. And that's why we're going to implement it.
Okay.
It baffles me why it's never been done.
All right. So Marsha, what are your thoughts about it?
I think it comes to accountability, particularly when it comes to policing. The first thing that happens is the chief or maybe the sheriff or whomever would say, nope, it's not our guys, we're good. So you have to recognize that, number one, there is a problem, and every department and every profession certainly has bad apples. But the part where you have to hold them accountable is very difficult, and sometimes, in some cases, often impossible, or they are unwilling or unable to do, to hold their staff accountable and recognize that there are bad apples. There should be a database, there should be accountability. And I always say that if you have these officers and 5 people who don't know each other are saying the same thing, something is going on, and there ought to be some accountability that within the leadership of the police department. And quite frankly, that has not been happening.
Okay, and so and the Honorable Judge Tuter, I will come back to you. So you've been on the bench for a while. Why hasn't someone come up with this idea of an implicit bias training before, and you retraining some of your judges there to make better decisions as it relates to Black defendants versus white defendants? Yeah, you have to unmute your mic there, Judge. Sorry.
Forgive me, Calvin.
Yes,
the idea that we haven't done it, I think, is a false narrative. Every single time I've attended the judicial training courses that we're required to go to throughout this state, there's always been a program related to some form of this topic. So I think the idea that we haven't been doing it is false. We have been doing it. Now, why hasn't that reflected change? I don't know. Like I said, 35% of our judges have been on the bench less than 5 years. And I've said many times at judges' meetings, if you need to be trained in this area and you don't recognize how sensitive an area this is, then you're doing the wrong job. I mean, to say that someone who is in the position of such power that holds person's liberty in their hands needs to be better trained on this, then they're in the wrong profession. So I agree we've got to do better. Some of this has been around for a long time. And all I can say is, as long as I've been a judge, 16 years, every single program, every single time I go to some large judges meeting where we have days on education, some form of this has been out there. So I can only speak for myself and for the judges here in the 17th.
Yes, sir.
And like I said, we started doing this topic. I've only been chief judge 3 years. We started doing this last year and had 4 or 5 sessions already. So, you know, if you're a judge and you need to be told, you need to be sensitive to these things, maybe you're in the wrong position. And maybe we have to do a better job than we're doing for sure. But I can't say anything more than that. I mean, this has been part of education for judges for a long time while I've been in the state.
Robert, I will come to you next, but Gordon seemed to wanted to jump in really fast. Give me 1 sec. Gordon, go ahead briefly, please.
You know, the chief judge hit the nail on the head, as well as Ms. Ellison, the president of the NAACP. You know, training is important. Implicit bias is an emotional, visceral, life experience manifestation of what you do. And what we have to recognize is, although we can train individuals to recognize where they may have some bias, we have to propel them and compel them to act on adjusting those lenses that they see the world through. The reality is, if someone has a fear of flying, or a fear of rattlesnakes, or a fear of, you know, lizards, you can train them that that's an irrational fear. You can give them all of the instruction on how planes fly into the sky and how that science makes sense, but that will not compensate for their emotional, visceral response to having to enter into an airplane. So what we have to do is watch those individuals after the training, look at the data after the training, and then hold them accountable, because at some point in time, you have to then ask, is it a fear-based response, or is it some other response that is causing them to not follow the training, not recognize the bias, and not compensate for the lens that they look at the world through?
And Robert, please go ahead and chime in. And I have about 4 questions from people already. Go ahead.
One of the things we take for granted is that exposure and this internal defense against implicit bias exists in everyone. You would be surprised how many people you speak to, middle-aged folks, who will tell you that before they were in their mid-20s, before they went to college, they had never spent any time with someone of another race or of a particular race, zero exposure. How does someone sitting in a position of power, a law enforcement officer, a judge, admit that openly without compromising their authority and or ability to do their job in the eyes of everyone who has heard this? If someone doesn't recognize this within themselves, what flips that switch to let them know that when they are sitting before a particular defendant or a particular citizen on the street, and if it is someone who looks like them, they see their nephew, their niece, and they immediately identify, you know, that would have been me, but by the grace of God. But when they look at someone and there is absolutely no identification with that person, immediately there is a threat. And it is that threat that they react to. It is that lack of identity with the individual before them that drives their decision making. We need to really start digging into that conversation, because yes, there has been implicit bias training for quite a while. But what is that training getting to? And is that training addressing that lack of empathy and exposure and identification with?
And that's a good point. And Sheriff Tony, I know you had your hand up, and once you answer this question as briefly as you can, I have another one that came from one of the participants who is logged in. Go ahead, sir. Sheriff Tony.
Well, thank you. You know, there's so many different elements here that has come up. Of course, what Marsha had mentioned about the importance of accountability to supplement any type of training. That is most certainly true. We can introduce all the different training models and sensitivity training, and then we have to be able to establish benchmarks and performance, which Gordon said. Are we still going out and over arresting? Are we going out and over stopping and frisking minorities? In addition to that, when you do have individuals who violate any new construct, policies, protocols, or procedures, it's on the will of administrators to do the things that are important, not only to just gain the public trust, but to ensure you're holding your men and women accountable, and not just the immediate wrongdoers, but it is a ripple effect so that you set the standard amongst your entire organization. I had to tackle some stuff early on over the last 2 years and make some very difficult decisions that I know, and no disrespect to my colleagues and administrators and other agencies and municipals, but I know for a fact they would not have made them because they did not make such decisions in cases similar to their own agency. And so what does that say for the whole county? Yeah, the sheriff's office, we're on a cord of changing and reforming, but we are going to be only as strong as our weakest link if the other municipals don't get on board with this type of change.
What can be done about the police officers that constantly get away with the wrongful death of people of color? That's more of a question for Sheriff Tony and for Judge Tuter. So let's try to tackle that in 1 minute, and then we'll give final comments.
Yeah, as far as the training, we mandated the training here. In terms of employees who violate policies, and they shouldn't get away with it. They should be held accountable, whether it be termination, suspension, criminal charges. I think that's one of the things that we have lacked as administrator is the willingness to actually charge people for violating the laws they were supposed to protect. And so it has to be a balance. What we expect for the civilians has to be expected for the law enforcement.
Okay, and this is also a question for the prosecutor as well, but Judge Tuter, I'll go ahead and let you chime in as well. Well, actually, first, before Judge Tuter, Mr. Pryor, you go ahead, and then it will eventually make its way to Mr. Tuter. So please go ahead.
I'll be short, and this is the short answer to it. We have to prosecute them. If they violate the law, they committed crime, we do an investigation, and the facts and evidence are there, we need to hold law enforcement accountable. Simple as that.
But there's the issue of the blanket immunity, Mr. Tuter, Judge Tuter. Please chime in if you will.
I'm not sure what blanket immunity you're referring to. The decision to charge and take to the grand jury, of course, is the state attorney's decision. We're not involved in that process at all.
Yes, sir.
As far as the previous question about diversity training, as I said before, it's mandatory with judges now, has been as long as I've been a judge. But the decisions that Harold has to make in charging police officers and Sheriff Tony to discharging police officers really is exclusively theirs. And most of those cases, some of them end up in jury trials, and the decision is almost always by a jury and not by a judge.
Yes, sir. And so to end the discussion, I will begin, or end how we began. I'll begin with Gordon Weeks. You all get about 60 seconds to give your final thoughts on this discussion today and to wrap it up and put a bow on it.
You know, this community is very proud and have a sense of encouragement with the comments that you've heard today. You know, you have each constitutional office holder, state attorney, the sheriff, the chief judge, civil rights organization with the NAACP, basically speaking in a very significant level of unison when it comes to the level of reform, the level of expectation and equity that's expected in this community. I pledge to you that I will continue my endeavors to always be a watchdog for faith, for truthfulness, and more importantly, for fairness, for how people are entering, how they're being treated, and how they're being sentenced and punished in the system. So with that, I think there should be a sense of, with this celebration of Martin Luther King, that equity is the prime element that we are all looking at when we're moving forward.
Equity is the prime element. And Mr. Pryor, your turn.
Yes, no, thank you for having me. Thank you to the committee and all the leaders and elected officials here on this meeting. I'll say this, not all of us are going to agree. I'm not going to always agree with Sheriff Tony. I'm not always going to agree with Mr. Weeks, but I will tell you this, and I'm committed to telling you this, that we will be willing to sit down and communicate with each other to ensure that we have a criminal justice system that's just and equitable for all people. And that's my promise to you as your elected state attorney. And I want you to hold me accountable. I want you to look at the numbers, look at the statistics, and come to me if there's any issues surrounding our community so we can fix it to ensure that we have a just and equitable criminal justice system for all. So thank you for having me, and God bless you all, and have a happy MLK Day.
And same to you. Mr. Tony, your turn.
Yeah, I'll be very brief, but I echo the sentiments that's already been shared here amongst this entire panel. And there's been a lot of discussion over the last year about the historic nature of all the newly elected officials. And I would just share this as a reminder to all of us that making history means nothing if we can't change the future. And so the expectation is high for us, as it should be. And I look forward to working with every single one of the members on here, because we can't afford to keep talking. We have to put things in place and change now.
Okay, Madam President of the local chapter of the NAACP, Sheriff Tony, thank you so much.
Thank you so much to the committee for having us, and all the leaders that were on. I look forward to continuously working with you, and I will and intend to hold each and every one of you accountable, as I hold myself accountable, to make sure that we're all treated in a fair and just manner. I want to say that we've got plenty of data. I'm willing to sit down. Many of you I have already begun to set meetings with. We are going to be working on police reform for the different agencies, and we are going to be working on police accountability to make sure that these officers are held accountable, and that certainly these judges, and there's an election that's going on in 2 years. In actuality, we're starting working on it right now, because it is important to have diversity on the benches, make sure that we have people who are on there wearing those robes, who understand what justice means for all of our communities. So thank you so much.
I have a feeling she is not going to go away. So she's going to be on you, Gordon and Harold and all of you guys. Mr. Vaughan, your turn. Brother Vaughan, Broward County Bar Association. Yes, sir.
Thank you so much, Calvin. I think all of us, all of our citizens here in Broward County should be optimistic. It's crystal clear from today's conversation. We have a chief judge of our circuit who has been visionary. He has been aggressive. He is fiercely committed to fairness for all of our citizens. We have a state attorney, a sheriff, a public defender who have taken bold steps in as short a time as they have been in office, but have demonstrated the humility required to engage all of our citizens for a better future for all of us. As president of the Broward County Bar Association, I'm privileged to say that our almost 4,000 members are excited and engaged and prepared to have this discussion and to facilitate this conversation for the betterment of our community. Thank you to the MLK Celebration Committee for facilitating this. Thank you, Calvin, for doing such a fantastic job. And we look forward to continuing this conversation and doing everything we can to help move us all in the right direction.
My pleasure. Thank you so much. And the Honorable Chief Judge, Jack Tuter.
Well, thank you, Calvin, and everyone participating today. I kind of will end where I started, and that is that I've been firmly committed to this progress before I was chief judge, helping some of our Black judges get appointed. I can't do much on the election side because I can't participate in elections. Whoever wins comes as a judge. But I think the hallmark here is a year from now, when you all meet again, hopefully not over the internet, we should see what we've done and where we came and what our vision is then, because the two most integral part of this discussion, state attorney, public defender, have really been making decisions here for about whatever it is, 16 days. And so we are going to have weekly meetings, monthly meetings to discuss these type of items. I'm firmly committed to keeping that jail cap down. I've discussed this with the sheriff many times. So I appreciate everybody's invitation, and I know Marsha from what meetings I've been with Marsha. She will be keeping an eye on us. So we are committed to making these changes, and let's meet again in a year and see how we've done.
Thank you very much. And I don't know where Tamica went. Is she still on board with us or no?
Okay, so my final thoughts, I think we all, in listening to the discussion, there's a common mantra that we need education and that we need accountability. And I think that as we work together in the community of Broward County to support criminal justice reform, that we also have to support those mechanisms that are already in place to divert individuals from the justice system, which include the adult and civil citation program. I think that we're off to a great start. I think that we've done a lot of work in Broward County. We have a long way to go, and we have the individuals that are in place to help us get us where we need to be. And I will just echo what Commissioner Holden stated before. What's good for Black America is good for all America.
Thank you,
So,
Tamica. Thank you.
yes.
Thank you to all of the panelists and Commissioner Holness. I believe that we have, we're talking about health